Hello, welcome back to Going Walkabout. In today's episode, I'm going to introduce to you my Node.js backend that is serving API requests coming from the mobile applications and my website. Every mobile client needs a backend, and Firebase is a great choice as a backend because it has everything for you in the servers. It allows you to have a data store. With Firebase functions, you can add additional functionality. But sometimes you want a little bit more, and I want a little bit more because I also want to run a website for administrative purposes and maybe in the future even more that requires very distinct security rules that I cannot do directly with Firebase. And therefore, I also want to have a backend. Now, I'm lucky because once you create a Firebase project, you also get a Google AppEngine project. And the Google AppEngine project is great to host services. I know you can also use Firebase functions, and I also do that as you have seen in previous episodes, but I use them mainly for triggers on my data store, and they're really good for that. They're great. But for other API requests, I think the whole developer experience and the ease of working, it's just nicer to do that directly on AppEngine. And I will show you how I have configured that, how I do that, and how I use Node on my backend. But before we go into that, I'll first want to show you a little bit of the website that I am going to build, or I am building, with some administrative functions. So here we see here a management console on the application, and it shows me, and this is on my test environment, a couple of test strips that I can see some statistics on it. And of course I want to be able to zoom in so that I can also see more details about these strips. And for that I need an API. I want to have a distinct backend serving API request, conform to a JSON standard, and I want to have a website. The website is currently being built in Vue.js, and that connects to that backend that is hosted on AppEngine. Later I will talk more about the Vue frontend, but today we'll address the AppEngine backend. So let's go into Visual Studio Code, and here you can see I have a folder AppEngine called as part of my overall project. I also have a folder with the website, Firebase, and the website, and that's the website built in Node.js, but this is my distinct Firebase backend. Of course, I could also create it in separate projects, but I've chosen to put everything in one project. And that AppEngine, within AppEngine, you can create multiple services, but you do need one service to default. I only have one, so it's the default service that is shown here. And there we have, for AppEngine, you always have your app.yaml that defines, in my case, it's running Node 10. It has some handlers to do the things you want to do. And then you can implement in your main.js, because it's Node, it will be launched automatically, your application. And what I do, I create Express, body parsers. Now, I create a Firebase admin reference, so I have access to all my Firebase functions with administrative privileges. The whole thing is that my server is supposed to run in a secured environment, so can access everything. So no security rules, for instance, apply when using Firestore. I initialize the application. I get my data from some configuration file, and that configuration file will be different for a development and a production environment, so that I can distinct the two. But today we're working on, of course, the development environment. I get my routes from my API, and I get some routes for the web that are not relevant at this point. And then I say use them, and I have some generic error handling, and I do some other stuff. Now, more important is my API routes. And here I get my router, and one of the things I use on my API endpoints is I want to go to a design first approach. So I design them with the open API specification, and I need to validate if my request and my responses are valid according to the specification. And that's why I use the open API validator to do that. Get some other stuff, and then my routes. Now, on every route, I use some, call it middleware, to check for permissions. So I get to my headers, I look at authorization, bearer token, and that's the token that gets sent from the client. And if you've been following my Flutter and iOS episodes, you will see that I have some kind of API class that gets the user's token, puts that into the header of the request before sending it to the backend. Here I get that token out of the request. and I verify it against my admin authorization. And if that fails, trouble verified in the token, of course we send a no permission. Or if the token is missing, we also send a request 403. And then we use the validator, so every request in that API endpoint gets validated, both on the request and the responses. And here I have some of the endpoints. And today we'll talk about this trip endpoint into more detail. Now let's first look at how it is working. My service is running, and on AppEngine it's really easy because you can run it. You run it once, don't need to think about it. Once you make changes in your code, automatically it restarts. So let's go to Firefox. We have here the URL for the trip. So if I refresh this URL, we'll get a forbidden. And I'll explain why. Because this is where we end up, in this routing, and it is looking and we have no bearer token. Because I didn't pass any kind of token the way I did. So if I want to make it easier for myself to test, of course I can use a different kind of client to test, but in my situation right now I just do like this. I said don't set the service is starting again. Now I can go back to my Firebase, refresh, and there we have the data. See, we have the trip with the start point, an end point, and a nice structure with a collection of posts and all the data we need to have. So how did I now get to that data? That's the next question here. As you can see, it's the endpoint here to get my trip. So here in the trips, we have the trips. We again create an instance to the Firebase admin. We need to open the database. We import some models because I put quite some effort in creating or mapping the Firebase Firestore data structure into some JavaScript objects. That's what happens here. So we get the trip ID from the parameters, we get the document here, the collection, and remember this database is created from the admin, so there's no security rules applied, so this will get you some data. If the document exists, I create a new trip and I return a reference to get to the post. So I want to get the post collection, and that will get into that, and then it adds to my trip that I created here, the post for each that it is found, and in the end it returns my trip as JSON with the trip here. And that's it. So most of the work is actually mapping the Firestore return documents into my JavaScript objects. That is what's happening here with creating a new trip, and here with creating a new trip post. And that's why I import those two models to retort that back. Now, of course, if something goes wrong, I have a little bit of error handling. The error handling is still something I'm working on to improve. But for now, let's dive into those models, because the models, they're stored here. And we have the trip model, for instance. The trip model defines the class with the constructor. I pass in the ID, that's the document ID from Firestore, and the data from Firestore. And I map that here. And my start and end point, they require a trip point, and that trip point is a new data structure that is defined here. So I build it up into objects, because then later it's much easier for me to use that, because this way I have very much control over serializing my Firestore data structure into a structure, a model that I want to have, and those are the models. And I deliberately make a distinction between the two, because I might want to change my data model for whatever reasons and not my interface. So I decoupled my data models from my API models. And these are the API models that we're talking about. And that's what I did here. The same for my waypoints. I have a collection of waypoints and I created, and then the actual output of that all is serialized. We see we have the start, what was the trip point with the structure, the end was the same structure here. And again, with the location, that gets mapped nicely, because if you look here in my location model, we create that again. And we can see that a lot in this trip point, because the trip point creates no location here, but the trip post does. So the trip post creates in my place my location. Now, in this way, we now have the clear interface and we can run that. But as I told in the beginning, I also want to validate that, because here in my API, we created the Open API validator. So the starting point, and that's very common with an API first approach, is design first. And for designing the API, we use the Open API specification, and that's what I have done here. So it's the Open API YAML file, and I use some tooling to make this a little bit more visible. And we have the API/strip ID, as you can see. We can call that, we can try it. Here we can send data, but we need to set my path parameter, because that's a placeholder. We can send it, and it will return me the same data as that we just saw in the browser. And this way I can build up my response, because I define here my URL, I define my path parameters, optionally query parameters, and I create a response, and my response in this time is an object with the trip, and inside the trip is a schema of a trip. For instance, if we go to another endpoint, this is an endpoint that is used by the mobile applications to find nearby places, and that nearby endpoint that has a query parameter, what is of location that needs to pass in, and as a result it is an object with the source, and the source the string, and then here a collection of places, so a member places with a collection of places. Now, once you define this first, it helps you building the validations and the correct structure in your serialization of your data. I will give you an example here. Let's go and set that path. Yeah, it is still here. But for instance, if we go to the trip and would get into this trip ID here and say instead of the validation options, it can only contain numbers. We now go back to my so now I change the API specification. I do need to restart my servers, so we'll start my service again. And now if we go to the browser to get to that endpoint again, we refresh, and it still returns me some data, returns me the errors, and it is saying response trip ID should match that pattern. It doesn't, because it also uses alphanumeric characters. And this is just an example how you can validate your API. And that is all done here in this Open API validator that you get installed. You can configure whether it wants to only validate your request or also your responses. Especially during development, I recommend to use both. I use both, I like that, but I might turn it off in production for performance and scalability reasons, and I cannot really change it. Now, if you have a public API, it might be useful to also validate, let's say during production, because those that are consuming your API will be very helpful if you do that. Now, this is the introduction to my Node backend running on AppEngine, serving my API endpoints. I will slowly start documenting all my endpoints into one nice specification, and I will slowly also transform the endpoints that I have to be more uniform and slowly. And I do that because I can then make it much more wider available. I haven't touched a lot on security and permissions on API endpoints, except it needs to be authenticated, and you just saw me turning that off. But in future episodes, I'll also dive into that deeper, because permissions and authorization is really important to get it right and to do it properly. So I hope you like that. I hope it was useful for you. If you like it, please like and subscribe. If you don't like the video, wait to the next one, because it might be better for you. I'll thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next episode.